Clayton Rivers had everything ripped away from him: his family, his dignity, and his future, until one moment shattered everything he believed in. Betrayed by those closest to him, he crafted a plan so meticulous and cold that it became a force of destruction, a reckoning no one saw coming. As he exacted his revenge, his enemies were left broken, powerless, their lives ruined. But Clayton's actions raised the ultimate question: was the cost of his revenge worth the price he paid? But before we dive deep into this gripping journey of justice and destruction, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button so you never miss out on our next tales. The clock on Clayton Rivers' desk read 7:45 p.m. The soft hum of fluorescent lights above was the only sound filling the quiet office. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the familiar ache of exhaustion creeping in. His work at Morton & Associates, an analytical firm nestled in the heart of the city, was relentless, and tonight was no different. A pile of reports lay scattered across his desk, each more urgent than the last. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, scrolling through data as his mind began to wander. He had hoped to finish the reports earlier, but the relentless nature of his job kept pushing the hours forward. His phone buzzed on the corner of his desk, snapping him out of his daze. Glancing at the screen, he saw a text from Maris. "Maris, don't bother picking up dinner. Ivy and I already ate." Clayton frowned. He hadn't even realized how late it was. It had been a long day at work, and he had planned to pick up takeout on his way home, something to make up for the missed family time. The message felt a little odd, though, especially with how curt it was. His mind raced for a moment as he typed out a quick response. "Clayton, everything okay?" He waited, but the reply didn't come immediately. His thumb hovered over the phone's screen for a moment, and he glanced at the clock again. 7:52 p.m. Why wasn't she replying? His gut twisted, an odd sense of unease settling in the pit of his stomach. Maris wasn't usually like this. So distant, so quick to brush him off. Had something happened? Was she all right? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but there was nothing to do about it right now. He needed to finish his work. Reluctantly, he pushed the worry aside and focused back on the reports. His mind kept drifting back to the text, though, as the numbers on the screen blurred together. It wasn't like Maris to not respond, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Still, there wasn't much time to dwell on it. Finally, after what felt like hours, he clicked the last button to submit his reports. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was done. For the first time that evening, his thoughts turned to home, to Maris, to Ivy. He glanced at a photo of his daughter, Ivy, on his desk, a recent picture from her school play. She had that bright smile, the one that could light up any room, and her eyes sparkled with that innocent curiosity only a child could have. For a brief moment, the weight of the office lifted off his shoulders, and he felt a flash of longing. He missed them. He missed being the dad who was there every night to read stories, to tuck Ivy into bed. Pushing back his chair, Clayton grabbed his jacket, stuffed his laptop into its case, and headed out of the office. The cold air hit him the moment he stepped outside, but he didn't mind. He was so ready to get home. As he drove through the quiet streets toward his neighborhood, his mind wandered once again to the text from Maris. Something didn't sit right. What had she meant by, "Don't bother picking up dinner"? The nagging thought stayed with him all the way home. As Clayton pulled into the driveway, the first thing that caught his attention was the sleek black Mercedes parked across the street. It didn't belong in their neighborhood. Their block was filled with modest homes, a few well-worn sedans parked along the curbs. But this car? This was different. Expensive. Out of place. Clayton's mind began to race, a feeling of unease settling over him as he glanced at the vehicle again. He shook off the instinctive feeling of dread and stepped out of the car, carrying his briefcase. The lights in the house were on, and the soft glow from the living room filtered out through the window, casting long shadows on the porch. He moved toward the door, but before he could turn the handle, something made him pause. There, in the window, he saw Maris. She was talking to someone, a man, dressed in a suit. Clayton's stomach churned. The man was standing too close to her, his hand resting casually on her shoulder. Clayton's breath caught in his chest. His mind screamed, "What is going on here?" He stood frozen for a moment, unable to move, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding before him. The man touched Maris's hair, a gesture so intimate that Clayton's heart sank. It wasn't just a business meeting. There was something more to this. Suddenly, his briefcase slipped from his hand, clattering loudly against the floor. The noise was enough to snap Maris's attention to the window. She turned, her expression instantly guarded. Clayton could feel the weight of the moment, the tension thick in the air, as he stared at her through the window. Something inside him shifted. A knot formed in his stomach. But it wasn't just from the shock. It was the sense that everything was about to change, that this would be the moment his entire world was upended. Through the living room window, Clayton could see Maris standing too close to the man, his hand now resting on her shoulder. The man's fingers brushed through her hair in a way that felt unnervingly intimate, a gesture so familiar that it twisted something deep inside Clayton's chest. He watched, frozen, as the scene played out before him like a slow-motion train wreck. He couldn't look away, but every second made his blood run colder. His mind raced, questions flooding in, but none of them made sense. What the hell is going on? The knot in his stomach tightened as he processed the sight in front of him. The man was a stranger to him. Clayton didn't recognize him, but the way Maris smiled at him, relaxed, comfortable, sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just business. It couldn't be. Suddenly, the sound of his briefcase slipping from his hand broke the silence, the noise echoing through the front yard. The moment was interrupted. Clayton's pulse quickened, and before he could even regain his composure, Maris turned toward the window. Her eyes met his, and for a fraction of a second, her expression flickered, something between surprise and guilt. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Maris, Clayton, you're home early." Her voice was strained, trying to hide something behind it. It was the tone of someone caught off guard. But Clayton wasn't fooled. He could feel the tension in the air thickening. His hand tightened around the door handle as he stood there, just outside, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. "Clayton, who's that man?" The question came out harsher than he intended, the ice in his tone betraying the fury building inside him. Maris seemed to flinch, but she quickly recovered, her gaze darting back to the man before meeting his eyes again. She didn't seem panicked, but there was a brief moment of hesitation that Clayton noticed. For someone who claimed everything was fine, that hesitation spoke volumes. "Maris, just a potential client. Real estate." Her words were quick, rehearsed, too rehearsed. Clayton didn't believe her. He had known Maris for years, and he could tell when she was lying. There was something about her posture, the way she couldn't quite meet his eyes, that told him the truth was much different from what she was offering. The words sounded like a story she had crafted to explain away whatever was really happening. But Clayton didn't need an explanation. He could already see the truth in front of him. His anger flared. He stepped closer to the window, leaning in, as if he could force the answers out of the glass. His voice, now tinged with suspicion and hurt, came out more sharply than before. "Clayton, where's Ivy?" He needed to know. Where was their daughter? The thought of Ivy sleeping upstairs, unaware of the chaos unfolding downstairs, made his heart ache. Maris's face tightened at the mention of their daughter, but she quickly regained her composure. "Maris." "Asleep." It was an offhand response, one that offered no comfort. Clayton could feel his chest tighten. He had come home, exhausted from a long day at work, expecting the warmth of his family. Instead, he had found this lie, this betrayal. A flood of emotions rose inside him: anger, disbelief, confusion, but above all, a crushing sense of betrayal. He had trusted her. He had worked so hard, day in and day out, to provide for their family. And now this. She was standing there with a man, so close, so at ease with him, while Clayton was left to watch through a window. He could feel the weight of it in his gut, a heavy knot of rage that he couldn't control. "Clayton, how long have you been sleeping with him?" The words burst out of him before he could stop them. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe an apology, maybe an explanation. But instead, Maris's face hardened. Her lips curled into a sneer. Her eyes flashed with anger, and for the first time, Clayton saw the contempt in them. "You're pathetic, coming home late and accusing me. I'm tired of waiting for you. This is my life now." The words struck him like a punch to the stomach. This is my life now. That was it, wasn't it? Clayton had always been so focused on work, so consumed with his job and the stress of providing. In doing so, he had neglected the very thing that mattered most, his family. But hearing Maris say it out loud, her declaration that she was done, that this was her new reality, hit him harder than anything. It was a final severing of the bond, a cold rejection of everything they had built. His mind whirled. This couldn't be happening. It was too much to process. But the reality was undeniable. The woman he loved, the woman he had trusted, was standing in front of him defending her affair like it was nothing. And the worst part? She wasn't even apologetic. "Get out." The words slipped from his mouth like a reflex, instinctive and raw. There was no thought behind them, just the need to escape from this nightmare that had suddenly become his reality. The anger was overwhelming, but so was the sense of betrayal. His legs felt weak as he stood there, staring at her, his fists clenched at his sides. How had things gone so wrong? Maris didn't flinch. Instead, she laughed, a bitter, hollow laugh that sent a chill down Clayton's spine. She took a step back, brushing past the man who had been standing so close to her. Her eyes never left his as she spoke, her voice dripping with disdain. "Maris, your house? I've got news for you, Clayton. This stopped being your house the moment you decided mediocrity was enough." Her words sliced through the air, each one like a wound. Clayton stood there, his body trembling, unable to process the venom in her voice. Mediocrity. The word rang in his ears. It was as if she were telling him that everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, wasn't enough. He had given his all to his job, to her, to their family, but in her eyes, it had never been enough. The bitterness of her words left a bitter taste in his mouth. His world, his entire life was unraveling right in front of him. This house, this home he had built, was no longer his. The person who had once shared his dreams, his hopes, was now someone he didn't even recognize. In that moment, Clayton realized something deep within himself. This wasn't just about a broken marriage or an affair. This was about the betrayal of everything he had believed in, and he would never let it go. Clayton, frustrated, gave a look of contempt and walked away, heading toward a hotel near his house. The next morning, Clayton woke to the blinding light of his phone screen. His head throbbed, the remnants of a restless night clouding his thoughts. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events from the night before. Maris's words, the man in the suit, the icy finality of it all. The weight of betrayal still hung heavily in his chest, and his body felt as though it had been through a wringer. Still disoriented, he reached for his phone, his eyes barely able to focus. It was only when he saw the subject line of the email that he froze. Divorce filing. Kendall Priestley, attorney at law. With trembling hands, he opened the email, dreading what he would find. The message was brief but direct. Kendall Priestley. Mr. Rivers, I regret to inform you that Maris Rivers has filed for divorce and has included allegations of domestic abuse, financial fraud, and emotional distress in her complaint. I strongly suggest you retain counsel immediately, as the legal proceedings are set to begin shortly. Please do not hesitate to contact our office to discuss next steps." Clayton's stomach twisted. His eyes skimmed the words again, as if trying to make sense of the message. Abuse? Financial fraud? The accusations were not just shocking, they were completely false. He had always been the quiet, responsible partner, focused on providing, on keeping their family afloat. Never once had he raised a hand. Never once had he mistreated anyone in his family. But as his thoughts settled, a sickening realization crept in. Maris wasn't just trying to leave him. She was trying to destroy him. She had crafted this story, this web of lies, to ensure that no matter what happened, she'd win. She'd take everything. Clayton's breath quickened. The feeling of helplessness that had consumed him the night before had now shifted to something darker, an icy fury that burned beneath the surface. The game had changed, and he was no longer going to sit by and let her dictate the terms. The following days passed in a blur of anxiety and disbelief. Clayton couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep at night, his thoughts consumed by the divorce papers he had received. As much as he tried to process the surreal situation, it felt like he was walking through a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The accusations that Maris had made against him, domestic abuse, financial fraud, emotional distress, were all lies, crafted meticulously to tear him down. But the more he tried to convince himself that it wasn't real, the more the paperwork in front of him proved that it was. The papers were damning. There were witness statements, fabricated medical reports, and doctored photos of injuries that didn't exist. Maris had played her part well, enlisting friends, her mother, and even some neighbors to back up her story. The lies were so expertly woven together that Clayton couldn't find a single thread to pull on without unraveling his entire life. As the days dragged on, Clayton's desperation grew. He had to speak to Ivy. He had to see his daughter. The mere thought of losing her forever crushed him. They had been a family, a small but happy unit, and now Maris was trying to erase him from their daughter's life completely. He couldn't stand the thought of Ivy growing up without him, so he called Maris. "Clayton, I want to see my daughter." He tried to keep his voice calm, but it trembled with the emotion he was barely holding back. He needed to speak to Ivy, to remind her that he was still her father. It was the only thing that kept him tethered to this nightmare. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Maris's voice came through, cold and unyielding. "Maris, that wouldn't be appropriate. The court agrees. You can check page 6 of the papers." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He could hardly breathe. Page 6. What did that mean? What had the court agreed to? He had already read the papers twice, no, 3 times, but his mind was racing too much to focus. What circumstances? He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The panic that had been simmering below the surface now boiled over. What had Maris done? What had she told the court? "Maris, you're unstable. I'm protecting my child from you." Her words rang in his ears, and Clayton's world tilted on its axis. Instability. The word stung. It wasn't just a rejection. It was an accusation, a condemnation of everything he was. The very foundation of his identity, his trust in her, was being dismantled, piece by piece, with every word that left her lips. He could hear the coldness in her tone, the finality of it. She wasn't just divorcing him, she was turning their daughter against him. "Clayton, Maris, please, I'm her father. I have the right to see her." There was a long silence before she spoke again, each word more cutting than the last. "Maris, you don't get it, do you? It's already too late. You've lost. I've moved on. Sutton and I are living together now, and we're planning for Ivy's future. You have no place in it anymore." The weight of her words hit Clayton like a ton of bricks. Sutton? Her new partner? Clayton had heard of him before, of course. The name had come up in their arguments a few times over the last few months, but he had never taken it seriously. He had never imagined that Maris would go this far, to move on so quickly, to bring someone else into their home, into Ivy's life. Clayton felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something vital inside him had broken. He had always feared that Maris would one day find someone else, but to hear it out loud, to know that Ivy would grow up around this man, a man who would now be playing the role of father, was more than Clayton could bear. He tried to push back, tried to regain control of the conversation, but Maris's voice came through again, colder than before. "Maris, I'm doing what's best for Ivy. She deserves stability. She deserves a real family, not someone who's constantly failing." The words stung so deeply that Clayton's breath caught in his throat. A real family. She was already painting him as the failure, as the one who had destroyed everything. He had always been there for Ivy. He had always done his best, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness to make sure she had what she needed. But now, Maris had rewritten their history. She had taken the narrative and twisted it beyond recognition, making him the villain in a story he didn't even recognize. The phone line went silent for a moment, and Clayton's mind spun. He couldn't just let her do this. He couldn't stand by and let her erase him from Ivy's life. He had to fight. But how? The court had already turned against him. The lies were too ingrained, too powerful. Maris had control now, and Clayton felt as though he were losing the last bit of power he had left. His thoughts turned dark. He had always believed in fairness, in doing things the right way. But now, as he stood on the edge of losing everything, he couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to regain what was his. He thought of the power his enemies held over him, the power that Maris had used to strip him of his daughter, of his life. But no, he couldn't let them win. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Clayton sat in the cold, sterile courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as he tried to steady his breath. The tension in the air was suffocating, the sound of paper shuffling and muted conversations around him, amplifying the weight of the moment. His lawyer had briefed him on the situation, but nothing could have prepared him for the full force of what he was about to face. On the other side of the room sat Maris, her mother Cecilia, and Kendall Priestley, the lawyer who had been orchestrating this entire battle. Maris had her usual composed demeanor, but there was something in her eyes that Clayton had never seen before, an icy determination. Cecilia, her mother, sat beside her, offering support, but her cold glare was unmistakable. Kendall, meanwhile, looked as sharp as ever, his smug expression almost too much to bear. The judge, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, adjusted her glasses and called the court to order. "Judge, let's proceed with the emergency custody hearing. Mr. Rivers, you may begin." Clayton swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. He had no idea how he was going to get through this. The court had already accepted the fabricated evidence Maris had presented. Photos of bruises that didn't exist, witness statements from neighbors who barely knew him, and testimonies from Maris and her family that painted him as a violent and unstable man. It was a nightmare. Clayton's lawyer: "Your Honor, we request full custody of Ivy, based on the evidence of Mr. Rivers's involvement in his daughter's life and his commitment to her well-being." "Mr. Rivers." The judge nodded and turned to Kendall, who was already flipping through his file with a quiet air of confidence. "Kendall Priestley, we are prepared to discuss settlement terms. Full custody of Ivy should be awarded to Mrs. Rivers, and as far as child support is concerned, $10,000 a month seems reasonable. Given the financial mismanagement on Mr. Rivers's part, this would ensure Ivy's future stability." Clayton's blood ran cold. $10,000 a month? It was more than he earned. He had been trying to keep his head above water for months, juggling bills and barely scraping by. There was no way he could afford that. His mind raced as he turned to his lawyer, desperate for some way out of this. "Clayton, that's more than I make." Kendall's smirk only deepened as he looked over at Clayton, his eyes filled with disdain. "Better." The words cut deeper than Clayton could have anticipated. He had worked hard his entire life, giving everything to provide for his family, and yet here was Kendall, dismissing him as if he were nothing. Clayton clenched his fists, his anger rising. But there was no time to waste on Kendall's taunts. He turned to Maris, his voice trembling with a mix of frustration and heartbreak. Previous topic about you lying to yourself. That was one of the questions, briefly. The room seemed to hold its breath as Maris stood up, tears already welling in her eyes. She turned to the judge, her face contorting into a mask of anguish. Maris, to the court. My daughter is terrified of him. She cries every time he's around. She's afraid he's going to hurt her. I can't let her be around someone like that. Her voice was shaky, but it was convincing. Clayton could hear the fake sincerity in her words. But the judge's face softened, her eyes narrowing with sympathy. It was exactly what Maris had intended. Her carefully crafted performance was working. Clayton felt the walls closing in around him. His life was being destroyed in front of his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had known Maris was capable of manipulation. But this was beyond anything he had imagined. He had always thought he was the good guy. He had always believed the truth would win out. But here, in this cold courtroom, the truth seemed irrelevant. Clayton's lawyer? Your Honor, we can provide testimony from Mr. Rivers' colleagues and family members that speak to his character. We believe these allegations are baseless and do not reflect the reality of his relationship with his daughter. Clayton could see the judge's eyes drifting back to Maris, her expression one of quiet sympathy. It was clear where the tide was turning. He could feel his world slipping away, piece by piece. The courtroom's lights dimmed and the screen glimmered. Clayton was gradually coming around. As the hearing continued, Clayton's mind raced with the implications of everything that was happening. Maris had turned his world upside down, and now, with the court system on her side, she was using that power to make sure he never saw Ivy again. Every word, every gesture from her was a calculated move to ensure that she remained in control of the marriage, of their daughter, of everything. And in that moment, Clayton realized that he couldn't fight the system on his own. The odds were stacked against him. Maris and her team had already won the first round. The only thing Clayton could do now was find a way to fight back. But what could he do? What options were left? But Clayton wasn't ready to give up yet. He knew this battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. And he would fight, no matter what it took. As the hearing drew to a close, Clayton's lawyer leaned in, his voice low yet urgent. Clayton sat on the edge of his seat, his hands clenched, trying to steady the storm of emotions inside him. The weight of the situation was suffocating, but there was no escape. Clayton's lawyer. The photographs they've submitted and Mrs. Devon's witness statement are pretty convincing. The court will likely side with them, unless we find something substantial to counter it. At that time, the court was pressing for a prosecution. Clayton's stomach churned. He couldn't fathom how they had gotten away with it. The photos of Maris's supposed bruises had been staged. He knew that. The marks had been put on her skin by makeup, nothing more. And the security footage of him yelling at her? Edited, cut and spliced to make him look like a monster. But the court didn't care about the truth. They cared about what was presented to them, and right now, Maris's side had the upper hand. Clayton, this is insane. The words escaped him in a rush, the raw disbelief in his voice betraying the desperation he felt. How could this happen? How could the truth be so easily twisted and manipulated? But there was nothing he could do. As the final statements were made, the judge rendered her decision. Maris was granted full custody of Ivy. The words hit Clayton like a physical blow. Full custody. He had known this might happen, but hearing it aloud made the loss even more real. He sighed in relief before looking up at the farm hall. The judge's voice was firm as she spoke. Judge, Mr. Rivers will be granted supervised visitation. The court believes it is in the best interest of the child for Mrs. Rivers to maintain full custody. The president said. Clayton's world collapsed in that moment. Supervised visitation. That was all he would get. He He was a stranger in his own daughter's life, and it felt as though everything he had worked for, everything he had fought for, had been taken away from him in an instant. He tried to maintain composure, but inside he was falling apart. Maris had won. And now, all he had left were the broken pieces of a life he couldn't put back together. Clayton stood in the small, dimly lit apartment he had rented after being forced out of the family home. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, and the air heavy with the silence that had become his constant companion. His life had crumbled in a way he never thought possible. In just a few months, he had lost everything: his wife, his daughter, his reputation, and his dignity. But amidst the ruin, a new feeling began to take root. Anger, not just the kind of anger that burns in the moment, but a cold, calculating rage that simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger as the days went by. He had tried to fight back through the legal system. He had tried to reason with Maris. But to her, it was all just a game she had already won. She had stolen his life, his family, and his future. And now it was his turn to make her pay. As the anger inside him deepened, Clayton began to plan. He researched everyone who had wronged him, Maris, of course, but also Sutton, her new boyfriend, Cecilia, her manipulative mother, and Dax, the opportunistic friend who had always been there to offer support while secretly pushing him further into the abyss. Clayton had always been methodical in his work, a man who thrived on precision and order. Now he applied that same methodical approach to his revenge. He spent hours digging into their lives. Sutton Raines, the man who had swooped in to take what was his, was a key target. Clayton learned everything he could about Sutton's business dealings, daily habits, and schedule. Sutton's arrogance was his weakness. He thought he was untouchable, that his wealth and influence made him invincible. But Clayton was going to prove him wrong. Clayton, thinking to himself, "They think they've destroyed me, but they have no idea what they've created." With the plan in motion, Clayton began assembling a team. He reached out to the Martinez brothers, two men he knew from his past, men with a reputation that didn't need explaining. They were known for getting things done, no questions asked. Clayton had never asked them for anything before, but now he needed them. The brothers agreed to meet at a rundown bar on the outskirts of town. Clayton walked in, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The brothers were seated in the back, their eyes already fixed on him. No words were exchanged, but the tension in the air was palpable. After a moment, one of the brothers spoke. "Martinez brother, you sure about this? Raines doesn't think anyone can touch him." Clayton leaned in, his voice low but steady. "Clayton, make him feel vulnerable. Hit him where it hurts." He didn't need to explain further. The brothers knew exactly what he meant. Sutton Raines had built his empire on the belief that no one could touch him. He was untouchable. But Clayton was about to show him just how fragile that illusion was. The plan was simple but effective. Hit Sutton's office, destroy his confidence, and make him question everything he had built. It wasn't about physical harm. It was about making Sutton feel small, insignificant, and vulnerable. The Martinez brothers didn't ask any more questions. They simply nodded and got to work. But Clayton wasn't stopping there. He had more targets in mind. As he watched Sutton's empire crumble, he began gathering blackmail material on the other people who had wronged him. Kendall Priestley, the smug lawyer who had twisted the law in Maris's favor, Cecilia, the manipulative mother who had fueled her daughter's lies, and Dax, the so-called friend who had smiled in Clayton's face while stabbing him in the back. Clayton knew the law was rigged against him, but with the right leverage, he could turn the tables. He dug into their lives, finding secrets they would do anything to keep buried. Kendall had connections that weren't exactly legal. Cecilia's business dealings were far from above board. Dax had skeletons in his closet. Financial troubles, shady investments, and a few indiscretions that would ruin his image if they ever came to light. Clayton spent weeks building his case. He recorded phone conversations, collected documents, and tracked their movements. Every piece of evidence he gathered was like another stone in the foundation of his revenge. He wasn't just going to ruin their lives. He was going to make them pay for every lie, every betrayal, every piece of their manipulation. As the days passed, Clayton felt a sense of purpose returning to him. The anger that had consumed him was now focused, directed toward a singular goal. He was no longer the victim. He was the predator, hunting down the people who had destroyed him, and he was going to make sure they knew what it felt like to lose everything. The first part of his plan was already in motion. The Martinez brothers had made their move on Sutton's office, leaving a trail of destruction behind. It wasn't just about the physical damage. It was about the message it sent. Sutton, the untouchable businessman, had learned that no one was above the law. And as Clayton stood back, watching the fallout unfold, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Sutton's arrogance had blinded him, but now it had a price. The next step was to strike at Kendall, Cecilia, and Dax. Clayton was careful, calculating. He knew that the moment he pulled the trigger on these blackmail deals, everything would change. Kendall, Cecilia, and Dax would be forced to make a choice: destroy themselves or stand beside the man who had betrayed him. And Clayton would make sure they felt the weight of that decision. Every move Clayton made, every piece of evidence he uncovered, brought him closer to his final goal. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter anymore. He was fighting for his dignity, his life. And in the end, when all was said and done, Clayton knew there would be no turning back. But that didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was that he was no longer the one on the receiving end of the pain. The final confrontation between Clayton and Maris took place at Sutton's penthouse, the very place where Maris had started her new life. The towering glass windows of the penthouse overlooked the sprawling city below, a view as cold and detached as the woman now standing before Clayton. The luxury of Sutton's world, the world Maris had embraced after tearing his apart, only made the anger burning inside Clayton more intense. Clayton had spent weeks planning this moment, ensuring he had the leverage to make her understand the consequences of her betrayal. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about forcing Maris to face the wreckage of the life she had built on lies and manipulation. And for the first time, Clayton wasn't going to let her hide behind her falsehoods. He was going to make her face the truth. "Maris, what do you want from me? You're just a pathetic little man." Her voice dripped with disdain, but there was something else in her eyes now, a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in her facade. She had always known Clayton as the dutiful husband, the man who would never fight back. But now, with everything he had lost, everything she had taken from him, Clayton was no longer the man she thought she knew. "Clayton, I want you to understand what you created. This is all on you." He stepped closer, his voice cold and steady, but with a growing weight that seemed to echo throughout the room. Maris had taken everything from him, his daughter, his family, his life, and twisted it into something unrecognizable. Now she would see the true cost of her actions. The power she had over him was slipping away, and in its place was the realization that Clayton had become something more dangerous than she had ever imagined. As Clayton spoke, there was a soft sound behind him, a small voice calling his name. He turned, his heart tightening as he saw Ivy standing at the entrance of the penthouse. She had been quiet, hesitant, but now she was looking at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. It was as if a switch had flipped in her mind. Slowly, cautiously, she took a few steps forward, as if trying to remember something she had once known. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Clayton's heart swelled as he looked at Ivy, his daughter, the child he had been forced to stay away from, the child he had been robbed of. But as their eyes met, Clayton saw something he hadn't expected: recognition. Ivy was remembering him. She was remembering the father she had once known. But what she didn't remember was overhearing the conversation between father and daughter. The emotional toll on Maris was immediate, her face twisted with panic and guilt. She hadn't expected Ivy to react this way. hadn't expected the bond between father and daughter to resurface after all these months. But it was too late. Clayton had already set this moment in motion. "No, Ivy, you don't." But Ivy was already moving toward Clayton, her small hands reaching out for him. The connection between them, even after all this time, was undeniable. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clayton felt like he could breathe again. His daughter, the one person he had fought for, was finally remembering who he was. Clayton knelt down to her level, his voice gentle as he spoke to her. "Clayton, it's okay, Ivy. I'm your father. I've always been here." Maris stood there, helpless, her eyes wide with fear. She had tried so hard to erase Clayton from Ivy's life, to replace him with Sutton. But now, her daughter was pulling away from her, seeking the comfort of the man she had once known as a protector. The truth was staring Maris in the face, and she couldn't escape it. Clayton took a deep breath and stood, turning back toward Maris with a cold fury in his eyes. He had done everything for this moment. Everything to make sure she would finally understand the consequences of her actions. But there was one last thing he needed to do to complete his plan. As the door to the penthouse opened, Sutton stepped inside, walking with confident strides, completely unaware of what had been unfolding in his absence. He smiled, his eyes flicking to Maris, then to Clayton. But when he saw the look on Clayton's face, something shifted in his expression. "Sutton, what's going on here? Why does it feel like I've walked into a showdown?" Clayton didn't answer. Instead, he turned fully to face Sutton, his eyes narrowing. Sutton was the man who had taken everything from him, the man who had wormed his way into Clayton's life and stolen his wife, his family, and now had the gall to look at him with smug indifference. "You really thought you could get away with this? Destroying my life? Taking my daughter? Now you'll pay." Without another word, Clayton moved. His hand shot out, grabbing the gun he had concealed in his jacket. The cold metal felt right in his grip, a tool for justice. No, retribution, in a world that had failed him. The gun was steady as he pointed it directly at Sutton, who instinctively took a step back, his eyes wide with panic now. Sutton, ever the confident businessman, tried to hold his ground, but there was no bravado left in him now. He saw the truth in Clayton's eyes, the raw fury and determination that had been building for months. "Sutton, you won't get away with this, Clayton. They'll come after you." But Clayton didn't flinch. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let Sutton walk away, not after everything he had done. Clayton squeezed the trigger, the shot ringing through the penthouse. Sutton staggered, his face twisting in shock, before he collapsed to the ground. The room was silent for a long moment. Maris's scream broke the stillness, but Clayton barely heard it. His heart was pounding in his ears, but he felt nothing. Nothing but the cold, quiet satisfaction of knowing that the man who had taken everything from him would never hurt him again. But even as he stood over Sutton's body, Clayton knew that the fight was far from over. There were still others to pay, the ones who had been complicit in his destruction. Kendall, Dax, and Cecilia. They would all feel the consequences of their actions. Clayton wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning of the reckoning he had promised them all. The power had shifted, and this time there would be no turning back. After executing his revenge, Clayton vanished. It was as if he had never existed at all. The police scoured every inch of the city, traced every lead, but no trace of Clayton Rivers remained. His enemies were left reeling, their world crumbling under the weight of their own treachery, while Clayton disappeared into the shadows, his name becoming little more than a whisper, a legend, a warning, a story passed from one to another. In the wake of his disappearance, Maris and her family were left without their power. Sutton was gone, and with his death, Maris's hold over Ivy slipped from her fingers. The empire she had built on lies and manipulation fell apart. The money, the status, the control, all of it evaporated. And with it, the illusion of safety she had once relied on. Cecilia was left to face the consequences of her machinations. And Dax, once a proud and untouchable figure, found his own reputation tarnished beyond repair. Kendall's career as a lawyer had been ruined by the blackmail material Clayton had collected, and now he was nothing more than a cautionary tale for others who thought they could escape justice. In the aftermath, it was as if the air had been cleared of the poison they had injected into the world. But as the dust settled, one question lingered. Was the price of revenge worth it? What had Clayton really achieved by tearing apart the lives of the people who wronged him? Detective Sarah Chun, standing over the scene where Clayton's path had vanished, spoke in a voice filled with disbelief. Detective Sarah Chun, Clayton Rivers, he's gone, completely vanished. No trace, no evidence. It's like he never existed. Her partner stood silently beside her, shaking his head as he glanced around. The case had consumed them for weeks, and yet there was no closure. Only emptiness. Detective partner, maybe he's everywhere and nowhere, a ghost, a story. They turned away, leaving behind the mystery that Clayton had become, a haunting reminder of the power of revenge and the unpredictable consequences of betrayal. But as they walked away, they couldn't help but wonder if Clayton's disappearance was the end, or just another beginning. Could a man who had taken justice into his own hands ever truly disappear? Or had he, in some way, become more than just a man? Something else entirely? Meanwhile, far away, high in the unfamiliar mountains, Clayton sat alone, watching the sunset with a quiet resolve. The world he had once known, the family, the home, the life, was gone, replaced by the cold winds of solitude. But in the silence of the vast, open landscape, there was a strange sense of peace. His revenge was complete. He had exacted the toll, forced his enemies to reckon with their actions. And though he was now a shadow of the man he once was, something inside him felt whole, even if the world around him remained broken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final fiery glow over the landscape, Clayton closed his eyes, allowing the cool mountain air to wash over him. His hands, once shaking with rage, were now steady. There would be no going back. He had burned every bridge, erased every trace. But as he sat there, alone in the fading light, one question lingered in his mind. Had he won? Had the consequences of his actions been worth the price? The world had been reset, but at what cost? Before everything faded into darkness completely, another big question still lingered in Clayton's mind. Can his life start over from here? Or will he forever remain a ghost, a legend of justice and revenge, unable to return from the things he's done? With that question in his heart, Clayton stood up, facing an uncertain future alone. But one thing was certain. His journey, though it had come to an end, would echo in the memories of those who had crossed his path and those who had created his suffering. The story of Clayton Rivers had ended, but the question of justice, revenge, and the price to be paid would resonate forever. Thank you for joining me on Clayton Rivers' journey today. As his quest for vengeance unfolds, the line between justice and destruction blurs. Do you believe his actions were justified, or did the cost of his revenge outweigh the consequences? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective.